May 23, 1945 brought an eerie stillness to the southern ridges of Okinawa as darkness enveloped the blood-soaked island. Sergeant William "Billy" Henderson crouched behind the jagged coral outcropping, his weathered hands gripping the most unusual weapon he'd ever been issued, the M3 carbine with its bulky M2 infrared scope attachment. The 20-pound contraption looked more like something from a science fiction novel than a battlefield implement, its ungainly battery pack strapped to his back like some mechanical parasite. Henderson had been skeptical when Lieutenant Colonel James "Iron Horse" Patterson first demonstrated the revolutionary device 2 weeks earlier. The entire concept seemed absurd, seeing through total darkness using invisible light. Yet here he was, part of the first combat unit to field Saint America's secret weapon against an enemy that had mastered the art of nocturnal warfare. The Japanese had turned night fighting into their greatest tactical advantage throughout the Pacific Campaign, striking like phantoms from cave systems and spider holes before vanishing into the inky blackness. The 24-year-old farmer from Nebraska had already survived Guadalcanal, Saipan, and Iwo Jima. But Okinawa presented challenges unlike anything he'd faced. General Mitsuru Ushijima's 32nd Army had transformed the island into a subterranean fortress, with elaborate tunnel networks connecting fortified positions that could withstand the heaviest bombardments. During daylight hours, American forces made steady progress, but when darkness fell, the roles reversed dramatically. According to information obtained from military archives housed at the National World War II Museum, the M3 carbine with its M2 infrared scope was first deployed during the closing days of World War II in the Pacific Theater, representing America's desperate attempt to neutralize Japanese night-fighting superiority. Henderson's unit, Company B of the 307th Infantry Regiment, had been selected as guinea pigs for this experimental technology. The infrared scope's green-tinted view revealed a ghostly landscape that seemed alien yet familiar. Twisted metal, shattered, coral, and the skeletal remains of palm trees emerged from the darkness like specters. But most importantly, it could detect human heat signatures moving through vegetati on and rocky terrain that would be completely invisible to the naked eye. The effective range was limited, roughly 70 yards under optimal conditions. But in the close-quarters combat of Okinawa's ridges, that distance could mean the difference between life and death. Henderson remembered his grandfather's stories about hunting white-tailed deer in Nebraska's sandhills, where patience and stillness determined success. Tonight, he was hunting a far more dangerous quarry, Japanese infiltrators who had perfected the art of silent killing. Intelligence reports suggested that Colonel Hiromichi Yahara's defensive tactics included extensive use of nighttime reconnaissance and sabotage missions designed to disrupt American supply lines and command posts. The young sergeant adjusted the scope's focus, scanning methodically across the terrain ahead. The infrared illuminator cast its invisible beam across the battlefield, creating a surreal green world visible only through the scope's specialized optics. Every shadow could conceal death, every rock formation might hide a spider hole, and every rustle of wind through the devastated vegetation could mask the sound of approaching enemies. As Henderson swept his enhanced vision across the ridgeline, he couldn't help but wonder what his adversaries were thinking. The Japanese infantry had no idea that American technology had advanced to the point where darkness no longer provided sanctuary. For months, they had relied on air superior night fighting skills to inflict casualties and maintain defensive positions that seemed impregnable. The psychological advantage of invisibility had been their greatest weapon. But tonight, that advantage would disappear entirely. Tonight, the hunters would become the hunted, and the darkness that had protected them would become their greatest vulnerability. Henderson tightened his grip on the carbine and continued his methodical surveillance, knowing that somewhere in that green-tinted wasteland, enemy soldiers were moving with the confidence of men who believed themselves unseen. Captain Takeshi Yamamoto pressed his back against the cool limestone wall of the tunnel system, listening intently to the muffled explosions echoing from the surface above. The 31-year-old career officer from Kyoto had spent the last 6 weeks transforming this section of Okinawa's natural cave network into a nearly impregnable fortress. His men had carved firing positions, ammunition storage areas, and living quarters from the solid rock, creating a subterranean world that could sustain them for months of siege warfare. The Japanese strategy on Okinawa differed dramatically from their previous island defenses. Instead of meeting the American invasion at the beaches, General Ushijima had ordered his forces to retreat to T. He Island's southern highlands, where they could maximize the defensive advantages of the terrain. Yamamoto's company controlled a critical section of the Shuri Line, a network of mutually supporting positions that had already cost the Americans thousands of casualties. During daylight hours, Yamamoto's soldiers remained hidden in their caves and tunnels, emerging only when necessary to adjust defensive positions or resupply ammunition. The Americans had learned to respect these underground fortifications after repeated frontal assaults had failed with horrific losses. But when darkness fell, the initiative shifted to the Japanese forces. Ho possessed an intimate knowledge of every trail, ravine, and approach route across their defensive sector. Yamamoto had trained his men extensively in night fighting techniques learned from veterans of the China campaign. They moved through the darkness with practiced stealth, using predetermined routes and hand signals to coordinate their movements. Their mission was psychological warfare as much as tactical advantage. By striking American positions during the hours of darkness, they could maintain constant pressure on enemy morale while conserving their own strength for the daylight defensive battles. The captain checked his watch. 0200 hours, the optimal time for reconnaissance and harassment missions. Intelligence reports indicated that American forces typically relaxed their vigilance during the early morning hours, making this the perfect opportunity to probe their defensive lines and gather information about troop dispositions and equipment. Yamamoto had personally selected 20 LVE of his most experienced soldiers for tonight's mission, men who could move through enemy territory like shadows. Private First Class Kenji Nakamura, a former schoolteacher from Osaka, crawled forward through the tunnel opening that provided access to the ridge system overlooking the American positions. At 26 years old, Nakamura had developed a reputation as one of the company's most skilled infiltrators, capable of approaching within meters of enemy sentries without detection. His ability to remain motionless for hours at a time made him invaluable for gathering intelligence on American defensive preparations. The Japanese had observed American night fighting capabilities with considerable interest throughout the Pacific campaign. While individual American soldiers displayed varying degrees of night vision adapted ion, their overall tactical doctrine relied heavily on illumination and overwhelming firepower rather than stealth and infiltration. This fundamental difference in approach had given Japanese forces a consistent advantage during nighttime engagements. Yamamoto understood that American technology was advancing rapidly. Reports from other sectors mentioned experimental equipment and unusual defensive behaviors that suggested new capabilities. However, physical limitations of human vision in total darkness remained constant, and no technology could eliminate the psychological advantages possessed by soldiers who had trained extensively in night fighting techniques. The captain's tactical philosophy emphasized patience and precise timing. His men would observe American positions for several hours before selecting targets of opportunity. The goal was not to inflict maximum casualties, but to maintain constant psychological pressure while gathering intelligence that could be used to plan larger operations. Every successful infiltration mission demonstrated Japanese superiority in night warfare and reinforced the belief that darkness remained their exclusive domain. As Nakamura disappeared into the labyrinth of coral formations and devastated vegetation, Yamamoto felt confident in his soldiers' abilities. They had executed dozens of similar missions over the past month, returning with valuable intelligence and occasional prisoners for interrogation. The Americans had proven themselves formidable opponents during daylight engagements, but they remained vulnerable to the ancient arts of stealth and infiltration. The underground war on Okinawa had become a contest between American industrial might and Japanese tactical innovation. While the Americans could deploy overwhelming firepower and seemingly unlimited supplies, the Japanese possessed the advantages of terrain knowledge, defensive preparation, and superior night fighting skills. Yamamoto believed that these factors would ultimately determine the outcome of the battle, regardless of the technological disparities between the opposing forces. Henderson's infrared scope suddenly revealed movement along the ridgeline, 3 heat signatures moving with deliberate precision through terrain that would be completely invisible to conventional observation. The green-tinted figures appeared ghost-like in his enhanced vision, their body heat creating distinct silhouettes against the cooler background of rock and vegetation. His heart rate increased as he realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in Pacific warfare. Japanese infiltrators detected while they believed themselves completely concealed. The lead figure moved with the fluid grace of a predator, pausing frequently to listen and observe before advancing to the next position of concealment. Henderson could see details that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. The soldier's equipment configuration, his weapon orientation, and even his method of movement across the broken terrain. The second and third figures followed at carefully spaced intervals, maintaining visual contact while minimizing their collective signature. Henderson faced a tactical dilemma that no American soldier had ever confronted. Should he engage immediately and risk revealing the existence of the infrared technology, or should he observe their approach and attempt to capture intelligence about Japanese night-fighting techniques? The decision would have far-reaching implications for future operations throughout the Pacific Theater. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson had emphasized the experimental nature of their mission. Every engagement would provide valuable data about the system's capabilities and limitations. The Japanese soldiers were approximately 60 yards away, well within the effective range of the infrared scope, but still outside the optimal engagement envelope for the M1 carbine's ballistics. Henderson knew that the .30 caliber cartridge had limited stopping power at extended ranges, particularly when engaging targets wearing field equipment and moving through covered terrain. He would need to allow them to approach closer before initiating contact. Through his scope, Henderson watched the lead infiltrator signal to his companions, using hand gestures that were clearly visible in the infrared spectrum. The sophisticated communication system suggested extensive training and combat experience. These were not amateur soldiers, but professional infantry with specialized skills in night operations. Their movement patterns indicated familiarity with American defensive techniques and probable knowledge of typical sentry positions and patrol routes. The realization struck Henderson with startling clarity. He was observing the enemy in their natural element, seeing them as they truly were when they believed themselves undetected. For the first time in the Pacific War, American forces possessed the technological advantage during night operations. The psychological impact of this reversal could not be overstated. Japanese confidence in night fighting had become a cornerstone of their defensive strategy. As the infiltrators approached the 50-yard mark, Henderson made his decision. He would wait until they reached optimal range before engaging, using the element of surprise to maximum advantage. The experimental nature of his mission required demonstrating the system's effectiveness under actual combat conditions. Every shot would be carefully evaluated by military observers who would determine whether the infrared technology justified its complex logistics and substantial cost. The lead Japanese soldier suddenly froze in position, his head turning slowly as if sensing danger. Henderson held his breath, wondering if some instinct had warned the enemy of his presence. Through the scope, he could see the soldier's face clearly, a young man with intelligent eyes scanning the darkness methodically. The moment stretched endlessly, as predator and prey remained motionless in the deadly game of night warfare. Henderson's training took over automatically. His breathing slowed, his grip steadied, and his finger found the trigger's precise pressure point. The carbine felt familiar despite its unusual accessories, the same basic weapon he had carried through 3 previous campaigns. But tonight, it was connected to technology that would revolutionize night fighting throughout the remaining war. The Japanese soldier resumed his advance, apparently satisfied that no immediate threat existed. Henderson tracked his movement through the scope, noting how the infrared signature changed as the target moved through different types of terrain. The information would be invaluable for future operators, learning to interpret the technology's capabilities and limitations. At 40 yards range, Henderson knew the moment had arrived. The 3 infiltrators had positioned themselves in a small depression that would provide ideal fields of fire against American positions. Their mission was clearly reconnaissance and harassment, typical of Japanese night operations throughout the Pacific Campaign. But tonight, their traditional advantages had been neutralized by technology they could not have imagined. Henderson centered the scope's reticle on the lead soldier's torso, accounting for the slight bullet drop at 40 yards range. His finger began the final trigger pressure that would announce America's technological revolution in night warfare. The M3 carbine's muzzle flash briefly illuminated the darkness as Henderson's first shot found its target. Through the infrared scope, he watched the lead infiltrator spin and collapse, his heat signature immediately changing as life departed his body. The sound of the gunshot echoed across the ridge system, but more importantly, it announced the arrival of a new era in night warfare, where darkness no longer provided sanctuary for America's enemies. The second Japanese soldier reacted with trained reflexes, dropping into a prone position while scanning frantically for the source of the attack. Through Henderson's scope, the man's confusion was clearly visible. He could see no muzzle flash, hear no follow-up shots, and detect no movement from the American positions. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. For the first time in their military careers, these professional soldiers found themselves completely exposed while believing themselves concealed. Henderson shifted his aim to the second target, noting how the infrared system revealed details invisible to conventional observation. The Japanese soldier's equipment, his weapon orientation, and even his breathing pattern were clearly displayed in the green-tinted world of the scope. This level of tactical information had never been available to infantry forces during night operations, representing a fundamental shift in the balance of power between opposing forces. The third infiltrator began a tactical withdrawal, moving with the desperate urgency of a man who understood that his mission had been fatally compromised. However, his movement only made him more visible in the infrared spectrum, his body heat creating a distinct signature against the cooler background terrain. Henderson tracked his retreat with methodical precision, understanding that allowing any enemy soldier to escape would risk revealing the existence of the new technology. As Henderson prepared his second shot, he reflected on the broader implications of this moment. Military historians would later recognize this engagement as the first successful use of man-portable infrared technology in combat operations. The psychological advantage that Japanese forces had maintained throughout the Pacific Campaign was being permanently neutralized by American industrial innovation and scientific advancement. The second shot was as accurate as the first, dropping the withdrawing soldier at 50 yards range. The remaining infiltrator attempted to locate his attackers by observing the muzzle flash, but Henderson's position remained effectively concealed behind the coral outcropping. The Japanese soldier found himself in an impossible tactical situation, under attack by an enemy he could not see, locate, or effectively engage. Through his scope, Henderson watched the final enemy soldier's desperate attempts to find cover and return fire. The man's thermal signature revealed his increasing agitation as he realized the hopelessness of his situation. Traditional Japanese night fighting tactics had become not only ineffective, but actively dangerous when employed against opponents equipped with infrared technology. The third shot ended the engagement definitively. In less than 2 minutes, Henderson had eliminated an entire Japanese reconnaissance team using technology that rendered their specialized training obsolete. The silence that followed was profound. No return fire, no desperate charges, no tactical withdrawal under covering fire. Simply the end of an engagement that had been decided before the enemy realized they were under attack. Henderson carefully documented his observations for the intelligence debrief that would follow. The M3 carbine had performed flawlessly at ranges up to 50 yards. The infrared scope had provided detailed target identification under conditions of complete darkness, and the psychological impact on enemy forces had been total. These findings would influence tactical doctrine development for the remainder of the Pacific Campaign. As he secured his position and prepared to report the engagement, Henderson understood that he had participated in a historical moment. The first combat use of American infrared technology had exceeded all expectations, demonstrating capabilities that would revolutionize night warfare. Japanese forces throughout the Pacific would soon discover that their greatest tactical advantage had been permanently neutralized. The implications extended far beyond this single engagement. Military planners were already developing tactics that would exploit infrared technology's advantages, while Japanese commanders would be forced to abandon night fighting strategies that had proven successful for 3 years of Pacific warfare. The balance of power had shifted decisively in favor of American forces. Henderson's successful engagement would be studied at military academies and tactical schools for decades, representing the moment when technology overcame traditional military techniques. The age of night vision warfare had begun with 3 precise shots on a ridge in Okinawa, forever changing the nature of infantry combat. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson received Henderson's after-action report with barely contained excitement, understanding immediately that the successful engagement represented far more than tactical victory. It marked the beginning of psychological warfare revolution that would cascade through Japanese defensive planning. Within hours, word of the engagement spread through American command channels, reaching General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. at 10th Army headquarters, and ultimately influencing strategic planning for the remainder of the Pacific Campaign. The Japanese response to their missing reconnaissance team revealed the devastating psychological impact of the new technology. Captain Yamamoto spent the entire following day searching for evidence of his lost soldiers, finding their bodies positioned in terrain that should have provided complete concealment from American observation. The precision of the wounds and the lack of any signs of close-quarters combat suggested an impossible scenario: enemies who could engage targets accurately in total darkness. Japanese intelligence officers struggled to explain the engagement, developing theories that ranged from advanced American night vision equipment to trained attack dogs capable of detecting human scent at extended ranges. The correct explanation, portable infrared technology, remained beyond their technological understanding, creating a mystery that undermined confidence in their most fundamental tactical advantages. Word of the mysterious engagement spread through Japanese defensive positions, with the rapidity typical of military rumors. Soldiers who had previously moved through darkness with complete confidence now questioned their vulnerability during night operations. The psychological impact was multiplied by the fact that no countermeasures existed for a threat they could not identify or understand. American commanders recognized the broader implications immediately. Colonel Edwin May, Patterson's superior officer, ordered additional M3 carbines deployed throughout the 10th Army's operational area, prioritizing units engaged in night defensive operations. The technology's effectiveness exceeded theoretical projections, demonstrating capabilities that would influence tactical doctrine development for the remainder of the war. The successful deployment of infrared technology coincided with broader changes in Pacific warfare that favored American forces. Japanese defensive strategies had relied heavily on night operations to offset American advantages in firepower and logistical support. By neutralizing Japanese night fighting capabilities, infrared technology eliminated one of the few tactical advantages remaining to enemy forces. Intelligence analysis revealed that Japanese forces were beginning to modify their operational patterns in response to the mysterious threat. Night reconnaissance missions decreased significantly, while defensive positions were reinforced with additional personnel to compensate for reduced intelligence gathering. These changes played directly into American strategic objectives by forcing Japanese forces into passive defensive postures. The psychological warfare implications extended beyond immediate tactical advantages. Japanese soldiers who survived encounters with infrared-equipped American forces reported experiences that seemed supernatural: accurate fire from invisible sources, precise engagement at impossible ranges, and the complete ineffectiveness of traditional concealment techniques. These reports created a mythology around American night fighting capabilities that exceeded the technology's actual limitations. Henderson found himself at the center of a classified program that would influence military development for decades. His detailed observations about infrared technology's capabilities and limitations were incorporated into training programs for other operators, while his tactical innovations became standard procedures for night fighting units throughout the Pacific Theater. The success of the infrared program attracted attention from military researchers developing related technologies. Plans were already underway for improved systems with greater range, lighter weight, and enhanced target identification capabilities. The M3 carbine represented only the beginning of a technological revolution that would transform modern warfare. As news of successful infrared deployments reached Washington, military planners began incorporating night vision capabilities into strategic planning for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. The psychological advantages demonstrated on Okinawa would be multiplied exponentially during operations against Japanese home islands, where night fighting traditions were even more deeply embedded in military culture. The revolution in night warfare had begun with Henderson's 3 shots, but its implications would extend far beyond the Pacific Campaign. Military historians would later identify this moment as the beginning of modern night vision warfare, when technology first overcame the limitations of human sensory perception in combat operations. The development of the M3 carbine's infrared system represented a convergence of multiple scientific breakthroughs that had been evolving since the early 1930s. Dr. Franklin Roberts, the lead engineer at the Army's Signal Corps laboratories, had spent 6 years perfecting the photoelectric tube technology that made the system possible. His work built upon German research captured during the early stages of the European campaign, combined with American innovations in electronics miniaturization and power management. The heart of the system was the M2 infrared scope, a complex assembly of lenses, photoelectric cells, and amplification circuits housed in a sealed aluminum case. The scope used an infrared illuminator to flood the target area with invisible light, which was then collected by the objective lens and converted into visible green images through photoelectric multiplication. The technology was revolutionary for its time, providing capabilities that seemed impossible to observers who lacked understanding of its scientific principles. Manufacturing the infrared scopes required precision machining techniques that pushed American industrial capabilities to their limits. Each unit contained over 200 individual components, many of which required tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The photoelectric tubes were particularly challenging to produce, requiring specialized glass-blowing techniques and vacuum systems that could achieve near-perfect seals. The power requirements represented another significant engineering challenge. The infrared system required substantial electrical current to operate the photoelectric tubes and illumination system, necessitating a battery pack weighing over 15 pounds. Early prototypes had used even heavier power systems, but improvements in battery technology during 1944 had reduced the total system weight to manageable levels for infantry operations. Field testing of the infrared system had revealed numerous practical challenges that required innovative solutions. The scopes were extremely sensitive to moisture and temperature variations, requiring special protective cases and careful maintenance procedures. Operators needed extensive training to interpret the green-tinted images effectively, particularly when distinguishing between enemy personnel and environmental features such as rocks, vegetation, or debris. The effective range of 70 yards represented a compromise between system capabilities and practical limitations. While the infrared illuminator could theoretically provide target identification at greater distances, the photoelectric tube resolution and the ballistic limitations of the .30 caliber cartridge made longer-range engagements impractical. Within its design parameters, however, the system provided unprecedented night-fighting capabilities. Quality control during manufacturing was critical to the system's success. Each infrared scope underwent extensive testing before deployment, including calibration of the photoelectric tubes, alignment of the optical systems, and verification of the electrical circuits. The rejection rate during final inspection exceeded 30%, reflecting the demanding performance requirements and the limitations of wartime manufacturing processes. The integration of the infrared scope with the M1 carbine required significant modifications to the basic weapon. The mounting system had to maintain precise alignment while withstanding the shock of repeated firing, necessitating reinforcement of the receiver and development of specialized mounting hardware. The additional weight and bulk changed the weapon's handling characteristics significantly, requiring modified training procedures for operators. Logistical support for infrared-equipped units presented unprecedented challenges for military supply systems. The scopes required specialized maintenance facilities with clean room environments and precision calibration equipment. Battery resupply became a critical factor in operational planning, as each system consumed power at rates that exceeded conventional field equipment by orders of magnitude. The scientific principles underlying infrared technology were classified at the highest levels of military security, with access limited to personnel with specific clearances and operational requirements. The Army's concern about technology compromise was justified. Captured infrared equipment could provide enemy forces with insights into American scientific capabilities that might influence their own research and development programs. Despite its limitations, the M3 infrared system represented a quantum leap in night fighting capabilities that would influence military technology development for decades. The lessons learned during its development and deployment would inform the design of improved systems that would eventually become standard equipment for military forces worldwide. General Ushijima convened an emergency conference of his senior commanders 3 days after receiving reports of the mysterious American night fighting capabilities. The meeting took place in the depths of the Shuri Castle tunnel complex, where elaborate Japanese defensive preparations had created an underground command center capable of withstanding the heaviest bombardments. The general's weathered face reflected the strain of defending Okinawa against increasingly sophisticated American attacks. Colonel Yahara presented intelligence reports gathered from survivors of night engagements with American forces. The pattern was consistent across multiple sectors. Japanese reconnaissance teams were being detected and engaged with impossible accuracy during conditions of complete darkness. Traditional countermeasures had proven ineffective, while attempts to locate American positions through conventional observation had failed entirely. Major Keizo Hayashi, the 32nd Army's intelligence officer, had developed several theories about American capabilities. His analysis suggested either advanced optical equipment capable of operating in total darkness, or trained animals with enhanced sensory capabilities. The correct explanation, portable infrared technology, remained beyond Japanese scientific understanding, despite their own research into similar technologies. The immediate tactical response involved fundamental changes to Japanese night operations throughout the defensive system. Reconnaissance missions were reduced by 70%, while remaining operations were restructured to minimize exposure to the mysterious American capabilities. These changes represented a significant defeat for Japanese tactical doctrine, which had relied heavily on night operations to offset American material advantages. Japanese engineers began experimenting with countermeasures based on their limited understanding of the threat. Smoke screens, reflective materials, and camouflage techniques were tested extensively, but without knowledge of infrared technology's principles, their efforts remained largely ineffective. The psychological impact of the unknown threat continued to undermine Japanese confidence in night operations. Captain Yamamoto's company received orders to develop alternative reconnaissance techniques that would minimize vulnerability to the American night fighting system. His soldiers began using remote observation posts, extended range patrol techniques, and increased reliance on daytime intelligence gathering. These adaptations reduced the effectiveness of Japanese defensive operations while increasing their vulnerability to American countermeasures. The Japanese response to infrared technology revealed fundamental limitations in their scientific and industrial capabilities. Unlike American forces, who could rapidly deploy new technologies and develop countermeasures to enemy innovations, Japanese forces lacked the research infrastructure necessary for technological adaptation during active combat operations. Communication security became a critical concern as Japanese commanders struggled to discuss the new threat without providing intelligence to American code-breaking operations. References to the mysterious American capabilities were limited to verbal communications within secure facilities, complicating efforts to develop coordinated countermeasures across different defensive sectors. Japanese medical personnel reported increased incidents of combat fatigue and anxiety disorders among soldiers assigned to night operations. The psychological stress of facing an invisible, incomprehensible threat had measurable impacts on unit morale and combat effectiveness. Some soldiers began refusing night patrol assignments, requiring disciplinary measures that further undermined unit cohesion. The failure to identify effective countermeasures against American infrared technology contributed to broader strategic reassessments within Japanese defensive planning. Military leaders who had previously emphasized aggressive night operations began advocating for purely passive defensive strategies that would minimize exposure to American technological advantages. Intelligence efforts focused on capturing intact American infrared equipment were intensified, but security measures surrounding the technology proved extremely effective. American forces had been trained extensively in equipment destruction procedures, while the complex nature of the systems made field repairs impossible even for trained technicians. The Japanese adaptation to American infrared technology represented one of the first examples of technological warfare's psychological dimensions. The mere existence of capabilities beyond enemy understanding could influence tactical behavior, even when the technology's actual limitations were significant. This lesson would prove relevant to military conflicts for decades follow. Wing World War II. The armistice of August 15, 1945, found Henderson training the next generation of infrared operators at Fort Benning, Georgia, where the Army had established its primary night vision warfare school. His experiences on Okinawa had made him one of the leading experts in tactical employment of infrared technology, and his detailed after-action reports had influenced doctrine development throughout the American military establishment. The success of the M3 infrared system during the final months of Pacific warfare had convinced military planners that night vision technology represented the future of infantry operations. Production facilities were being expanded to support deployment of improved systems throughout the Army and Marine Corps, while research programs were developing second-generation equipment with enhanced capabilities and reduced weight. Henderson reflected on the transformation that had occurred since that first engagement on the Okinawan Ridge. What had seemed like science fiction 18 months earlier was now standard equipment for specialized infantry units. The psychological advantage that had belonged to Japanese forces throughout the Pacific Campaign had been permanently transferred to American forces through technological innovation. The broader implications of infrared technology extended far beyond tactical advantages in night fighting. Military strategists recognized that the principles demonstrated by the M3 system could be applied to other sensory limitations affecting combat operations. Research programs were already investigating applications for enhanced hearing, improved target identification, and communication systems that could operate under conditions where conventional methods failed. According to military historians at the Army War College, the development and deployment of infrared technology during World War II represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between technology and warfare. For the first time, scientific innovation had provided infantry forces with capabilities that exceeded the limitations of human sensory perception, establishing precedents that would influence military development for decades. The training programs developed around infrared technology emphasized the psychological dimensions of technological warfare as much as technical proficiency. Operators learned to exploit the fear and confusion created by capabilities that enemy forces could not understand or counter. These lessons would prove valuable during subsequent conflicts where technological disparities played decisive roles in combat outcomes. Henderson's role in the infrared program had earned him recognition as a pioneer in night vision warfare, but he remained focused on the practical implications of the technology rather than its historical significance. His recommendations for improved systems emphasized reliability, ease of maintenance, and reduced logistical requirements, factors that would determine whether infrared technology could be effectively deployed on a larger scale. The Japanese military's inability to develop effective countermeasures against American infrared technology had demonstrated the importance of maintaining technological superiority in modern warfare. American military leaders were already applying these lessons to post-war planning, recognizing that future conflicts would be decided by scientific and industrial capabilities as much as traditional military factors. The legacy of the night vision revolution extended beyond military applications. Research conducted during the development of infrared technology had produced innovations in electronics, optics, and power systems that would influence civilian industries for decades. The relationship between military research and technological development had been permanently altered by the success of programs like the M3 infrared system. As Henderson concluded his final training session of the day, he understood that he had participated in events that would be remembered long after the specific details of individual engagements had been forgotten. The revolution in night warfare that began with 3 shots on an Okinawan ridge had transformed the nature of infantry combat and established principles that would guide military technology development into the 21st century. The infrared system that had seemed so revolutionary in 1945 would eventually be surpassed by technologies that Henderson could barely imagine. But the fundamental lesson remained constant. In modern warfare, the side that could see its enemies while remaining unseen would possess decisive advantages that could overcome even the most determined resistance. The night vision revolution had begun, and its implications would continue to influence military conflicts for generations to come.